The first thing remembered was not an invention or a mistake, but a sound, soft and uncertain, like a lullaby carried through a half-open window. It came from nowhere in particular, yet it stayed with him always, even when years tried to bury it beneath noise. Rick was a child then, though even in childhood there was a heaviness in his eyes, as though he had already seen far beyond what he should have. Nights in that small, dim room were filled with shadows that seemed alive, but instead of fearing them, he welcomed them as company. He used to whisper to them, asking questions he could never ask the adults who rushed through their lives too quickly to notice how quiet he was. The house was unremarkable, walls of faded paint, a floor that creaked with the weight of passing years, but to him it was a universe. In the corners of that home were mysteries, tiny threads of spider silk glowing in the moonlight, the tick of the clock that felt like a heartbeat too slow to belong to any person. He would lie awake, his head tilted toward the stars beyond the thin curtain, wondering whether they remembered him, whether they whispered his name back. Sometimes he thought he could hear them. Loneliness was not sharp for him in those days. It was more like a gentle tide, something that rocked him instead of drowning him. He grew to love the sound of his own thoughts, letting them stretch and wander into strange places. Once, when his mother asked what he was staring at so intently on the windowsill, he only smiled and said, "I'm waiting to see if the dust learns how to fly." She laughed, not unkindly, but with that distracted amusement of a grown-up who has no time to linger on the oddities of children. Still, he kept watching, patient, certain that one day the dust would surprise him. As he grew taller, the world around him began to expect more, answers, explanations, a kind of logic that could fit neatly into words. Yet Rick felt that some truths were too fragile to be trapped in sentences. Instead, he carried them like secret treasures, the way his grandmother's humming could slow his heartbeat, the way a half-melted sandwich tasted better than any feast, the way silence sometimes felt fuller than speech. He learned early that the smallest things, if noticed carefully enough, could hold entire universes inside them. Still, there was a sadness forming in him, a quiet awareness that his way of seeing would always feel out of place in the rush of others. He watched his father measure days by tasks, his neighbors count worth by possessions, his friends chase laughter that echoed but did not linger. Rick moved differently, slower, with pauses that carried meaning no one else could hear. And though he never said it aloud, he feared that one day he might forget the stars' whispers, that he might grow into the same hurried silence as the rest of them. On certain nights, when the wind slipped through the window with a cool breath, he promised. Himself he would not forget. He swore softly in words only the shadows could hear that he would keep the strangeness alive. For it was the strangeness, the unexplainable, the gentle oddities that made life worth noticing. And though he could not yet name it, this promise would shape the rest of his journey, guiding him toward choices that would ripple quietly across the multiverse like a sigh carried on starlight. The promise he whispered to the shadows did not vanish with morning. It lingered, like the faint aftertaste of a dream, clinging to his thoughts even as the sunlight spilled across his face and pulled him into another day. Rick carried that promise quietly, never speaking it aloud, but living it in small ways. When the other children played games that demanded quick shouts and quicker victories, he found himself pausing to notice the details, how the dust rose beneath their feet, how the laughter curved like arcs of light in the air. While others forgot these moments as soon as they ended, he tucked them away, certain they were more important than anyone realized. Yet the world, insistent and unyielding, kept pushing him forward. Teachers praised his cleverness, though they rarely understood the peculiar way his mind wandered beyond their questions. They saw the answers he gave, precise and strange, and mistook them for quick wit rather than the quiet hours of observation that birthed them. At night, alone in his room, he would sketch ideas in the air with his hands, tracing invisible diagrams only he could follow. They were not inventions in the usual sense, not yet, but the beginnings of a language only he seemed to understand. There was a comfort in this solitude, but also a growing ache. Sometimes, when his grandmother sat by the window humming her endless tune, he would rest his head against her knee and listen, hoping the melody could steady the restless current inside him. She never asked what troubled him, perhaps because she knew that some restlessness cannot be cured, only carried. He loved her for that, for giving him space without questions, for humming softly enough that he could imagine the stars outside were singing with her. Still, loneliness deepened its roots. Friends drifted in and out like seasons, drawn to his brightness at times, but unsettled by his silences. They did not know what to do with someone who paused too long, who stared too deeply, who seemed always halfway between here and some other place. Rick learned to smile at the right moments, to nod at the right words, but inside he clung to that earlier vow, to never forget the strangeness, to keep it alive even when it made him feel apart. One night, lying awake with the ceiling painted by shifting shadows of the trees outside, he realized something. The ache he felt was not a weakness, not a flaw, it was a doorway, a passage to places others could not see because they did not dare to linger in the quiet long enough. Perhaps that was why the stars whispered to him and not to them. Perhaps the silence he carried was not emptiness, but an invitation. The thought comforted him, though it also frightened him. For what if the doorway opened to something vast and unanswerable? What if it stretched too far, beyond the safety of what he knew? His small body trembled beneath the blanket, yet his eyes stayed fixed on the darkness above, as though daring it to respond. And in that daring, in that quiet defiance of fear, something shifted within him. A certainty, subtle but undeniable, began to form. Whatever lay ahead, no matter how strange or heavy, he was meant to step through it. The certainty that had settled in him that night was fragile at first, like a candle flame wavering in the breath of doubt, but it grew steadier with each passing day. He began to notice the way patterns repeated themselves, how raindrops fell against the glass in rhythms that mirrored the beat of his own heart, how the moonlight returned to his window at the same angle each month as though keeping its own quiet promise to him. These repetitions felt like hidden messages, and he leaned into them, believing that the world was speaking to him in a language most people never learned to hear. At school, the teachers mistook his distant gaze for distraction, but Rick was not drifting. He was tracing possibilities. A single equation on the blackboard became 1,000 branches of thought in his mind, not confined to the chalk, but extending outward into shapes and outcomes that shimmered like constellations. His answers confused them, not because they were wrong, but because they strayed into places beyond the narrow lines they had drawn for him. He felt both proud and burdened by this strangeness, as though the knowledge he carried had arrived too early for his age. Evenings remained his sanctuary. The house quieted after dinner. The world slowed, and he could retreat to his small room where shadows waited like old companions. He began sketching his thoughts on scraps of paper, circles, lines, fragments of words. Sometimes they resembled machines, though he did not yet think of them as such. They were more like echoes of dreams, half-formed visions that slipped away as soon as he tried to capture them. Yet even their incompleteness felt important, as if the act of drawing them was enough to remind him that his vow still lived. The ache of loneliness persisted, but now it carried a strange sweetness. He no longer saw it only as absence, but as space, an open field inside him where possibilities could bloom. Still, there were moments when the weight of it pressed too heavily. On those nights he would sit with his grandmother by the window. Her humming had grown slower, softer with the years, yet it still wrapped around him like a blanket. She did not need to say anything. Her presence was proof that quiet did not always mean alone. One evening, as the stars blinked awake above them, he asked her if she ever thought the sky remembered. She tilted her head, smiling faintly, and after a long pause said, "Maybe it doesn't remember us, but it lets us remember ourselves." The words sank into him like seeds, and though he didn't fully understand them, he knew they would stay with him. Her wisdom was like that, gentle, understated, leaving space for him to grow into its meaning. In the days that followed, Rick found himself listening more closely, to the hum of the refrigerator, the rhythm of footsteps on the street, the soft sighs of the wind in the trees. Everything seemed to carry a kind of music, a reminder that nothing was ever truly still. The world, he thought, was alive in ways that could not be measured, and maybe his role was simply to notice, to witness, to keep the strangeness alive not only in himself but in everything he touched. It was in this noticing that the doorway widened, pulling him further toward what lay ahead. He could not yet see where it led, but he no longer felt the same fear. Instead, there was a quiet anticipation, like the hush before a lullaby begins. Something was waiting just beyond the edge of what he knew, and he felt himself leaning toward it, ready to step through when the moment came. The quiet anticipation that had begun to grow within him did not fade. It deepened with each day, wrapping itself around ordinary moments until even the simplest tasks felt touched by some hidden weight. When he walked to school beneath the pale morning sky, he noticed how the clouds shifted as though rearranging themselves in answer to his thoughts. When he listened to the creak of the old floorboards at night, he imagined the house breathing along with him. These were not fantasies to him, but threads of truth, delicate and easily missed, and he held them gently as if they might guide him toward what waited beyond. There came a day when he lingered after class, long after the other children had scattered. His teacher, tired and preoccupied, had left the chalkboard filled with unfinished equations. Rick stood before them in silence, staring not at the answers but at the spaces between them. He traced invisible lines across the air, connecting one symbol to another, building shapes that no one else could see. In that moment, he felt both entirely alone and impossibly full, as though the universe had leaned close enough for him to hear its breath. He did not write anything down. He only let the pattern live inside him, another secret vow added to the ones he had already made. At home, his grandmother noticed how distant he had become, but she did not scold him. Instead, one evening she placed a small object in his hand, a locket, its metal worn and warm from years of use. Inside was a faded photograph of someone he did not recognize. "Your grandfather," she said softly. He believed in things that couldn't be explained too. The words lingered in the air like a blessing. Rick held the locket close that night, feeling as if the photograph itself were listening, as if it too kept watch over the quiet strangeness he had promised never to abandon. It was around this time that he began to sense a shift within himself, subtle but undeniable. His thoughts stretched further than before, moving beyond the familiar walls of his house, beyond the streets he walked each day. When he closed his eyes, he could almost see 1,000 paths branching outward, each one shimmering with possibilities. He did not yet know what they meant or where they led, but he felt them calling, as though urging him to choose. This sense of choice was both comforting and overwhelming, for he knew that with each step forward, he carried not only his own life, but the weight of all those unseen paths. Loneliness still pressed against him, but it no longer frightened him in the same way. It had become something else, a companion that walked beside him in silence, reminding him that emptiness could also be spaciousness. On nights when he could not sleep, he would whisper to the shadows and to the stars beyond his window, not asking for answers, but simply acknowledging their presence. And in return, he felt them acknowledge him, as though the universe itself had become his quiet confidant. One particular night, the wind slipped through the cracked window and stirred the papers scattered across his desk. Among them was a half-drawn diagram, lines and circles unfinished, waiting. He watched as the breeze lifted the page slightly, as if urging him onward. He picked up his pencil, and without fully knowing why, let his hand move. The lines curved into new forms, shapes that felt both foreign and inevitable. When he finally stopped, the page before him was filled with something he could not name but instinctively recognized. It was not a machine, not exactly. It was a map of possibilities, drawn not on paper but into his own becoming. And as he stared at it, a quiet certainty filled him once again. This was only the beginning, a first step across the threshold of a doorway he had long felt waiting. Something was unfolding, patient and vast, and he was already walking toward it, carried by the promise he had made long ago to never let the strangeness slip away. The map, or what he now thought of as one, rested in his hands like something delicate, fragile, yet oddly full of meaning. Rick's fingers traced the curves and lines, his mind dancing between wonder and confusion. He didn't know what it meant, only that it felt right. This was something he had been searching for without knowing it, something that spoke not just to his mind, but to the quiet spaces within him that yearned for more. More than the lessons at school, more than the words spoken by his grandmother, more than the predictable rhythms of his days. It was the night after he had drawn the map that the first shift began. He sat at his desk, staring at the paper, unable to tear his eyes away. The room was filled with shadows, the kind that stretched lazily across the floor as the moonlight filtered through the cracks in the window. He had learned over time to trust the whispers in the dark, and tonight there was a whisper that felt different, less like a passing breeze, more like a call, soft yet clear. He stood up from his desk, almost without thinking, as though his feet were moving towards something before his mind had fully caught up. The house seemed different, larger somehow, stretching beyond the walls, he knew. The quiet murmur of the night felt like it was wrapping around him, guiding him somewhere deeper, to a place he hadn't yet touched, but always sensed was just beyond reach. As he moved through the house, the world outside became more vivid, the night air colder and sharper. The stars blinked overhead, each one seeming to pulse with some unseen energy. He walked, following some quiet pull that urged him forward, his steps steady but unsure. There was no fear, only a quiet knowing, as though the path was waiting for him to notice it. When he reached the backyard, he stood still for a long time, his eyes tracing the outlines of the trees that stood like ancient sentinels in the moonlight. The world felt incredibly still, yet full of possibilities, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. And then, almost imperceptibly, the air shifted. The ground beneath him hummed, faint but undeniable, a sensation that seemed to come not from the earth but from the space between the stars themselves. It was then that he understood. The map he had drawn was not just a map of places, but a map of moments, of openings. It was guiding him not through physical space, but through time, through choice, through things he had yet to become. And the hum in the air, he realized with a sudden clarity, was the sound of those possibilities, waiting to unfold. He stood there, in the stillness, feeling something in him stir. It wasn't an excitement exactly. It was a quiet recognition, the same quiet that had always followed him, the same hum he had heard as a child when he first whispered to the stars. It was all connected, the map, the hum, the stillness, each piece, each moment, pulling him gently forward. And though he had no idea what was coming, no idea where it would lead, Rick knew one thing for certain. This was his path. Not one made by anyone else, not one that could be drawn with any pen or pencil. This was the path of quiet choices, of unseen steps, of the kind of life that would not fit into any mold, but would always be exactly what it needed to be. With a final glance at the stars above him, Rick took a step forward, his heart steady, his mind open, and the map still tucked in his hand. The world seemed to shift with him, and as he walked into the night, he felt as if he was stepping into something vast, something that had always been waiting for him. The night air was cooler now, carrying with it the soft scent of earth and damp leaves. Rick walked through the quiet, his feet brushing over grass that seemed to whisper beneath him. The world around him was vast, yet contained, as if every step he took was being watched by something older than time itself. He moved without hurry, the pull that had guided him outside still soft but persistent, leading him forward with a quiet certainty that felt more like remembering than discovering. It wasn't long before he reached the edge of the forest. The trees stood like silent giants, their branches reaching toward the sky, and Rick paused before stepping under their canopy. There was something about the way the light from the moon filtered through the leaves, casting gentle shadows on the ground, that made the forest feel alive in a way that defied logic. It wasn't the sound of rustling leaves or the occasional bird call that made it so. It was the stillness, the way everything seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for him. He took a step forward, his body almost automatically aligning with the rhythm of the earth beneath him. It was as though the ground knew his name, and the air, thick with the smell of pine and damp moss, seemed to pulse with the same energy he felt stirring inside him. The stars above had faded, hidden behind the thick canopy, but Rick wasn't bothered. The darkness here wasn't the absence of light, It was the presence of something deeper, something that enveloped him with a quiet embrace, inviting him to move further into it. As he walked deeper into the forest, the path began to grow narrower, the trees pressing closer, their roots twisting up from the earth like ancient hands reaching for him. His steps grew slower, more deliberate, as if the forest itself was asking him to notice the details, to feel the moment before the next one unfolded. He didn't know where he was going, or why he was moving with such purpose, but the stillness in his heart told him that he was exactly where he needed to be. His mind, usually so filled with the logic of equations and answers, now seemed to settle into a quiet space, one that didn't require any explanation. Every rustling leaf, every shift in the breeze seemed to whisper something to him, but he did not need to understand it. He only needed to listen. And then, through the soft hum of the forest, he heard it. A voice, so faint it almost seemed like part of the wind. "Rick," he stopped, his heart skipping a beat as he searched the darkness around him. There was no one there, no shape or figure standing between the trees. The voice had been too soft, too ethereal to belong to anyone, yet it felt so real. "Rick." The voice came again, clearer now, though still distant, as though it was calling to him from somewhere deep inside the forest. It wasn't a sound that frightened him. Rather, it stirred something within him, a sense of recognition, of knowing that whatever was calling him was not something to fear, but something to understand. His feet moved again, more instinctively this time, drawn toward the voice that called his name. He didn't question it. He simply followed, as though the forest itself were leading him, guiding him deeper into the unknown. The path before him seemed to shift and change with each step, new routes opening up, old ones disappearing behind him. It was as though the forest was alive, shifting with the rhythm of his own heartbeat, guiding him towards something. He knew he was being led, but where? And to what? The voice came again, clearer still, and this time Rick knew. It was not the forest calling him, nor was it the wind. It was something else, something that had always been there, waiting for him to listen. His breath quickened as he moved faster, his mind racing with the possibilities of what lay ahead. Then ahead of him, the forest opened up into a small clearing. The moonlight poured through the trees, casting silver shadows on the ground, and there, in the center of the clearing, was a figure. It was not a person, not exactly, but something in between, a presence that was both familiar and unfamiliar at once. Rick stopped at the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure did not move, did not speak, but there was something about it, something in the stillness of the moment that told him everything he needed to know. He was not alone, not really. The figure in the clearing did not move. It stood there, bathed in the soft, silvery light of the moon, and for a long moment Rick was unsure whether it was real at all. It felt like a dream, a vision that slipped just out of reach, yet there was something undeniably present about it, something that spoke to the very core of him. He took a cautious step forward, his feet barely making a sound on the soft earth, as though the very ground beneath him was holding its breath, waiting for him to approach. The air around him seemed to shift, thick with the weight of the moment. The trees stood still, their branches frozen in time, and the night was unnervingly quiet. It was as if the entire world had paused, holding itself in place, watching the two of them, the figure in the clearing and the boy standing on the edge, waiting for something to unfold. Rick's heart beat faster now, a quick rhythm that seemed to echo through the stillness. He wasn't afraid, not really, but there was an intensity in the air, a sense that this was a moment he could not return from, no matter how small his next step. There was no going back from this place, from this decision, from this realization. He could feel it deep in his bones. With every step closer, the figure became clearer, though its features remained obscured in a gentle haze. It was as if it was made of the same fabric as the night itself, shadow and light woven together in delicate patterns that defied any sense of physical form. Rick could see no face, no eyes, but somehow he felt its gaze. He felt as if it was looking directly at him, even without the need for vision. Rick. The voice was soft, the same voice he had heard before, but this time it was closer, more intimate, as though it was speaking not just to his ears but to the depths of his mind. He stopped, standing at the edge of the clearing, the figure still motionless before him. His breath was steady, but his pulse quickened, the world around him so quiet that he could hear the faint rustle of his own thoughts. He didn't know what he was supposed to do, what he was meant to say or feel, but he knew, with certainty, that the moment was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. "You've come far," the figure spoke again, its voice like the sound of leaves moving in the wind, gentle and yet full of weight. Rick felt a strange pull, an instinct deep within him, urging him to take that final step forward. And so, he did. As soon as he crossed into the clearing, everything seemed to shift. The air around him felt different, charged, as if something had awakened in the space between the earth and the stars. The trees seemed to stretch higher, their branches swaying with a soft rhythm that was both ancient and eternal. He could feel the heartbeat of the world as though the earth itself was alive, beating in time with his own pulse. The figure did not move, but Rick felt it, felt the presence it exuded, the weight of its being. He could sense that it was not just a person, not just a being of this world. It was something older, something woven into the fabric of the universe itself. "You are ready," the figure said, its voice like a breeze on a still night. Rick didn't understand the words, not fully, but he didn't need to. He felt them seep into him like the night air. Ready for what? He wanted to ask, but the question felt unnecessary, because he knew the answer already. He had always known it. The figure extended a hand, its shape blurred, shifting in and out of focus like the world around him, and Rick, without hesitation, reached out to take it. In that moment, the world seemed to change. Time bent, stretched, and rippled like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. He could feel something pulling at him, drawing him into the depths of something vast, something beyond the scope of his understanding. But it was not frightening. It was a sense of being welcomed, of being guided into something larger than himself, something he had always been meant to find. As his fingers brushed the figure's hand, the stars above seemed to realign, shifting in a pattern that felt familiar and new all at once. The trees around him swayed with a new energy, and the earth beneath his feet seemed to hum with life. The quiet hum he had felt before, the one that had whispered to him since childhood, now rose to a gentle crescendo, filling him with a warmth that spread through his chest and out to his fingertips. He was no longer alone, not in the way he had been before. This was not a place of solitude. It was a place of connection, a place where all the threads of his life, all the quiet moments and all the strange choices he had made had led him to this point. And here, in this space, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The figure's hand closed gently around his, and he felt something inside him, something deep and quiet shift. The moment his fingers touched the figure's hand, something deep inside him shifted as though a veil had been lifted, and for the first time, Rick could see the vastness that lay beyond the edges of his understanding. The world around him seemed to dissolve into a blur of light and shadow, the trees, the ground, and the sky all blending into one seamless flowing current. He no longer felt like an observer. He felt like he was part of something much greater, a thread woven into the very fabric of the universe itself. The feeling was not overwhelming, nor was it frightening. Instead, it was a calm certainty that filled him with peace, a quiet knowing that everything was unfolding exactly as it should. The voice that had called to him before now seemed to echo in his mind, not as words, but as a resonance, a deep hum that matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat. "You have come far," the figure's voice whispered again, but this time it was not a statement, it was an invitation. Rick didn't know what to say, but he didn't need to speak. The air around him felt charged, alive with the weight of meaning. He could feel the pull of something ancient, something that had been waiting for him long before he had ever noticed. There was no need for explanation. The figure's presence told him everything he needed to know. Without thinking, he took another step forward, the figure's hand still gently holding his. It guided him, but not in the way one might expect. It didn't lead him with force or urgency. Instead, it led him with an unspoken understanding, as if they were walking in time with some quiet, eternal rhythm. The forest around them began to shift again, but this time it wasn't just the trees that moved. The very air seemed to hum with energy, with possibility. The space between them stretched and contracted, expanding like the tide pulling back before a wave. Rick felt the sensation of travelling, not through physical distance, but through something more fluid, more timeless. He didn't look back. There was nothing behind him anymore, nothing to return to, and nothing that needed to be explained. All he had was the moment, and it was enough. As they walked, the landscape around them began to change. The trees, once dark and towering, began to thin, replaced by a wide expanse of sky. The ground beneath them softened, and the air grew warmer. The stars above no longer seemed distant. Instead, they seemed to be within reach, close enough to touch, like the soft glow of fireflies caught in the night. The figure beside him remained silent, but Rick felt it. He felt the presence of something vast and ancient, something that had watched over him all this time, guiding him in ways he couldn't have understood before. It wasn't a deity or a force to be worshipped. It was something far simpler, far quieter. It was a presence that had always been, waiting for him to notice, waiting for him to be ready. In that stillness, in that quiet exchange, Rick understood. He understood that the journey he had been on, the path he had followed with so much uncertainty, had been leading him here. He had always known, in some part of himself, that this was where he would end up. Not by force, but by choice. And as he walked, side by side with the figure, Rick let go of the questions that had once weighed on him. He no longer wondered what this place was or what it meant. He no longer needed to search for answers in the stars or the shadows. The answers were inside him, quiet and gentle, and they had always been. With each step, the world around him seemed to open wider, and the weight of uncertainty that had once followed him began to lift. He was not afraid anymore. He was not lost. He was exactly where he needed to be. As Rick walked alongside the figure, the world around him continued to shift in ways he couldn't fully comprehend, but he no longer felt the need to understand. There was a quiet comfort in simply being, in moving forward without asking the world to make sense. He no longer felt rushed, no longer concerned about what was coming next. The uncertainty that once had been an ever-present companion now felt distant, like a memory he could leave behind without fear. The air had grown warmer, but not uncomfortably so, just enough to feel like the embrace of a long-forgotten season, a soft reminder that things changed, that even the most enduring of forces could shift. The ground beneath his feet, once cool and damp, now felt firm and steady, as though the earth itself had adjusted its rhythm to match his. Rick looked up at the sky, which had transformed into a soft, glowing canvas of colour. The stars were still visible, though they now felt closer, as if the heavens had descended just enough to be within reach. But it wasn't the stars that drew his attention now. It was the quiet hum of life around him, the soft, rhythmic pulse of everything in balance, in motion. Every blade of grass, every tree, every subtle shift in the air seemed connected, part of a larger dance he had only now begun to understand. The figure beside him did not speak, but Rick felt its presence more strongly than ever. It wasn't a voice he heard, but a quiet knowing that settled in his chest. He understood now that this journey wasn't one of answers, but one of experience. It wasn't about what he would find, but how he would grow. The figure wasn't leading him towards something. It was guiding him inward, toward a deeper understanding of himself, of the space he occupied in this vast and mysterious world. The path they walked was not a road, not a trail, but something much more fluid, like a stream that carved its way through the landscape, winding and meandering, but always with purpose. And as he walked, Rick felt something within him begin to soften. He wasn't sure if it was his heart or his mind, but something inside him began to open. He began to notice the small things, things he hadn't seen before, even though they had always been there. The way the light played on the edges of the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch like fingers reaching for something just beyond their grasp. the sound of his footsteps, soft on the earth, almost as if the ground itself was welcoming him. The breeze, gentle on his skin, whispering through the leaves with a language he could almost understand. He didn't know how long they had been walking, or how far they had come. Time no longer seemed to hold the same weight. What was a moment? What was an hour? What was a day? It was as though the very concept of time had loosened, stretching and folding in on itself, allowing Rick to exist outside of it, just for a while. But there was something else too, something that had been pulling at the edges of his mind. It was not fear, not exactly, but a quiet tension. The further he moved, the more he felt it. Something was waiting, something he wasn't fully prepared for. He had the sense that there was something ahead, something he was meant to see, but he didn't know if he was ready for it. Still, the pull was there. He couldn't stop now, even if he wanted to. The figure beside him, though silent, seemed to acknowledge this unspoken truth, and in that acknowledgement Rick felt a strange sense of reassurance. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it. He didn't have to understand it now. He didn't have to know the outcome. He just had to keep walking. The figure turned, and Rick followed, as if they were part of the same breath, part of the same unspoken rhythm. Ahead of them, the land began to rise, a gentle slope that led towards something in the distance, something he couldn't quite make out. But the anticipation of it filled the air around them. The world seemed to hold its breath again, and so did Rick. Whatever was waiting, it was not far now. He could feel it in the air, in the way the stars blinked above him, in the way the earth whispered beneath his feet. The journey, which had begun in a quiet place of solitude, was slowly leading him towards something much greater than himself. And as he walked forward, the figure at his side, Rick understood that this was not just his story. It was a story that had been unfolding for as long as the stars had been burning, a story that had no end, only moments, and he was part of it. The ground beneath Rick's feet grew softer as they continued up the slope, the earth no longer cool but warm, as if it were alive, breathing with them. The figure beside him remained silent, yet its presence was more pronounced than ever, as, though it had become part of the landscape, woven into the very fabric of the night. Rick could feel a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. The anticipation that had been building within him was now a palpable force, a current that seemed to pull him forward, urging him to continue, to press on toward the unknown. With each step, the world around them seemed to change. The trees, which had once loomed over them like ancient guardians, began to thin, their trunks bending and twisting into forms that were both familiar and strange. The moonlight, which had been soft and distant, now seemed to flood the clearing, spilling across the land in long, liquid streams. It was as if the very landscape was awakening, stretching and shifting with them as they moved through it. Rick's heart beat in rhythm with the world around him, and for a moment he felt as though he too was part of the earth, part of the sky, the stars, the pulse of the universe itself. The weight of time seemed to vanish entirely. It was as though he had stepped into a place where moments were fluid, where past and future were indistinguishable, and only the present existed. And then, as they reached the crest of the hill, Rick saw it. Ahead of him, framed by the clearing, was a vast expanse, a field that stretched as far as the eye could see, its edges blurring into the horizon. But what struck him most was the light. It wasn't the harsh, cold light of day, nor the pale glow of the moon. This light was soft, warm, like the first rays of dawn, yet it didn't seem to come from anywhere. It filled the air itself, swirling gently around him, as though the very atmosphere was alive with it. The figure beside him did not move, but Rick could feel its gaze, its quiet encouragement. He took a step forward, and the air seemed to respond to him, shifting and rippling in waves. As he moved closer to the center of the field, he felt a warmth spread through him, a deep, soothing warmth that reached into the corners of his soul, touching places he hadn't known existed. It was as though this light, this presence, was speaking to him without words, filling the empty spaces in his heart with something he couldn't quite define. He took another step, and then another. With each step, the field seemed to open wider, revealing more of its secrets. There were shapes in the distance, indistinct at first, but as Rick drew closer, he saw them more clearly. Figures, shadows moving in the distance, like faint memories of people or places he couldn't fully recall. They didn't approach him, but they didn't retreat either. They simply existed, a quiet presence in the far reaches of the field, as if they had always been there, waiting for him to notice. Rick stopped, feeling a soft tug in his chest as though something inside him were reaching out toward them. They were not real, not in the way people were, but they were real in another sense, in a way that made his heart ache with recognition. He wanted to approach them, to ask who they were, what they meant. But as he opened his mouth, the words didn't come. Instead, the light around him seemed to intensify, swirling faster, wrapping itself around him like a comforting embrace. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth wash over him, and in that moment he felt everything: the stars, the earth, the figures in the distance, the figure beside him, all of it, as though he were both nothing and everything at once. The hum, the quiet song of the universe filled his mind, and he understood without understanding. He had come here not to find answers, but to feel them, to experience them, to know, in the deepest parts of himself, that this moment, this journey, had always been about the becoming, not the knowing. When he opened his eyes, the figures in the distance were gone. The field was empty again, save for the soft glow of the light, which now seemed to settle around him, quiet and at peace. He stood in the center of it, feeling more himself than he had ever felt. The path ahead was still unclear, but for the first time he wasn't afraid. He didn't need to know the way. He didn't need to have all the answers. He simply needed to keep walking. The field stretched out before him, vast and serene, but Rick's gaze was drawn to the gentle glow at its center. It was not the harsh light of the sun nor the cool light of the moon. It was something softer, more intimate, like the final note of a lullaby, holding the world in a quiet embrace. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, yet time no longer seemed to matter. The world had slowed, wrapped in this moment of stillness. As he stood, he felt the presence of the figure beside him, though it had not moved. Its silence was no longer an absence, but a presence itself. There was a sense of understanding between them, as though the journey had been about this, the connection. It wasn't about solving riddles or finding answers. It was about the space between the questions, the quiet places where meaning could be felt rather than explained. Rick began to walk again, this time not from any particular urgency, but from a need to move, to feel the rhythm of the earth beneath his feet. The air felt alive with energy, with possibility, and as he walked, he allowed the quiet hum that had accompanied him to grow louder. It wasn't a sound, not in the way a song would be. It was a vibration, a current that seemed to run through him, filling him with something pure and unspoken. The ground beneath him felt different now, warmer, softer, as if the earth was parting to guide him forward, and he didn't question it. His heart was still, no longer filled with the need to understand, just to be. The figures that had appeared in the distance, those faint memories of people he hadn't met, hadn't spoken to, were gone now, but their presence lingered. They were not gone from him. They had simply faded into something else. Ahead, a faint ripple in the air caught his eye. It was subtle at first, like a breath of wind stirring the grass, but it held a kind of invitation. Rick moved toward it, drawn as he had been before, quietly, without hesitation. The field around him seemed to open wider, the light deepening in intensity as if the land itself was part of some grand, silent unfolding. When he reached the center of the field, the ripple expanded, revealing an object at its heart, something solid yet shifting, as though it were both present and intangible. It was not something he recognized, yet it felt familiar, like a memory he hadn't fully recalled. It was there, in front of him, just beyond reach, but it didn't need to be touched to be understood. This object, whatever it was, held a piece of him, something that had always been part of his journey but which he had not yet fully realized. The sensation was not unlike the pull he had felt when he first stepped into the clearing, the same quiet invitation to come closer, to reach deeper into what lay beyond. And in that moment, he understood. The figure beside him was not leading him to a specific place. It was not guiding him to a destination. It was guiding him to a truth that wasn't a place or an object, but a realization. It was the quiet knowledge that everything he had experienced, everything he had lived, had led him here, not to the object, not to the answers, but to the acceptance of the journey itself. The hum of the universe swelled around him, not in a rush, but in a steady rhythm. It wasn't an ending, nor a beginning. It was simply part of the continuous movement of things. Rick didn't need to chase it. He just had to breathe with it. The figure finally spoke, not in words, but in a way that Rick felt deep inside. It is not what you find, but what you allow yourself to become. Rick stood still for a moment, allowing the weight of the words to settle in his chest. He didn't need to say anything, didn't need to respond. It was enough to feel them, to understand that this moment was not about answers. It was about the space between questions. It was about being open, being present, and letting things unfold as they would. And in that, Rick found peace. He didn't need to know what came next. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to rush ahead. Whatever came next, he would meet it with open arms, ready to walk forward, ready to breathe with the rhythm of the universe, wherever it took him. As the soft hum of the universe swirled around him, Rick felt the last remnants of uncertainty slip away. It wasn't that the world had become clearer, not in any conventional sense. Instead, it had become more expansive, more fluid, and in this vast openness he felt a profound sense of peace. There were no answers waiting to be found, no destinations to reach, only moments, small, quiet moments that could be lived, not solved. The figure beside him remained as still as ever, its presence now a quiet echo in the back of his mind, not something separate, but something integrated into his own understanding. He no longer felt the need to seek it out. It was as if the figure had always been a part of him, a part of the landscape, and now they walked together, not as two separate beings, but as one, moving with the rhythm of the world itself. Rick took a deep breath, the air around him sweet and cool, heavy with the scent of the earth and the faintest trace of something floral, something ancient. It was the smell of memory, of places long forgotten, and it anchored him here, in this moment, where time no longer seemed to matter. He didn't need to look back, for the past had already settled inside him, folded into the space between each breath. And he didn't need to look ahead, for the future too seemed to stretch endlessly, a soft unfolding that would come as naturally as the next breath when it was ready. The world around him began to change again, but this time there was no shock in it. The trees that had surrounded him before began to recede, their towering forms giving way to an open sky that stretched across the horizon, infinite and boundless. The light, soft and warm, filtered through the clouds, bathing everything in its gentle glow. It was as though the landscape was dissolving into something else, something formless but not empty. Rick's footsteps became lighter, almost as if the earth itself were carrying him now, holding him in a tender, unspoken rhythm. He didn't know where he was going, but he didn't need to know. The very act of walking was enough. Each step was an act of trust, a surrender to the quiet guidance that had always been there. The figure beside him didn't speak, but Rick knew it was watching, not with eyes, but with an awareness that filled the space between them. There was no need for words now, only presence. The figure had shown him that answers were not to be grasped, but to be lived, and in that living, in the quiet acceptance of the present moment, there was everything. As he walked, Rick's mind drifted back to the path he had taken to reach this point, the long, winding road that had led him through confusion, through moments of doubt, and through the endless search for meaning. But now there was no more searching. There was only being, only experiencing. And the universe, in all its vastness, seemed to breathe with him. The stars, now visible again in the distance, shimmered softly, as though beckoning him forward. They were not far off, not out of reach. They were not something he needed to chase, but something he could simply allow himself to be drawn toward. With every step, the world around him continued to shift, becoming more and more like the inside of a dream, fluid, mutable, ever-changing. And in this dream, Rick felt something stir deep within him, a quiet understanding that he had always known. The universe was not a place to be explored. It was a thing to be, felt, to be experienced, and to be lived. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to know what was coming next. He only needed to keep walking. And so he did, each step carrying him further into the soft, gentle unknown, where the rhythm of the world and his own heartbeat became one, where time was no longer a concern, and where he, at last, could simply be. The field around him seemed to stretch on forever, yet Rick's footsteps felt lighter with each passing moment, as though the very earth beneath him was becoming a reflection of his inner state. The quiet hum, the soft pulse that had accompanied him since his first step in the forest, now echoed more distinctly within him. It was no longer an outside force. It had become part of him, woven into the very fabric of his being. The world, with all its mysteries and questions, had settled into a rhythm that no longer demanded answers. It simply was, and in that being, Rick found a quiet contentment. As he moved through the ever-shifting landscape, there was a sense of both familiarity and newness. Everything felt familiar in a way that was both comforting and strange, as if he had always known it, yet it was unfolding before him in a way he had never fully understood. The sky above, a soft gradient of colour, felt like the canvas of a story yet to be told, a story he was part of but could not control. And that, he realised, was exactly the point. The story wasn't his to write. It was unfolding all around him, within him, and all he had to do was walk through it. The trees, which had once stood like silent sentinels, had transformed into something else entirely. Their trunks had softened, bending in gentle curves, their leaves shimmering with a quiet light, not unlike the stars. As Rick passed by them, they seemed to bow in acknowledgement, not of him, but of the journey itself. They were simply part of the path, just as he was. Ahead of him, the landscape began to change once more, but this time it felt different. The shift wasn't one of physical space, but of something deeper, something more subtle. There was a movement in the air, a slight change in the rhythm that Rick could feel in his chest, like a heartbeat not his own, but shared. He wasn't alone, not in the way he had once thought. The figure remained at his side, a quiet companion that never hurried, never pushed. It didn't need to speak, for it had already given him everything he needed to understand. Rick no longer sought answers from it. He no longer needed to know its purpose or what it represented. It simply was, and in its presence he felt no need to question. The hum in the air began to change, becoming more intricate, like a melody, not quite clear but undeniably there. It surrounded him, filling the space with its resonance. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like the breath of the world, the pulse of existence itself. Rick felt it in his bones, in the very rhythm of his being. This wasn't a place to be understood. It was a place to be felt, to be experienced in the deepest sense of the word. Rick continued forward, drawn by that unspoken invitation, the quiet pull that seemed to emanate from the space ahead of him. It wasn't fear that pushed him forward, nor was it curiosity. It was something simpler, something more fundamental. It was a sense of trust, of knowing that the path, however unclear, was one he had always been meant to walk, and in walking it, he had come to understand that there was no wrong way to go. There was only the movement forward, the rhythm of the steps that had always been his own. As the landscape before him softened, taking on the quality of a dream, Rick's heart opened to the truth he had always known but had never fully embraced, that he was both the journey and the traveller, the question and the answer. The moment was both everything and nothing, a quiet stillness that spoke volumes without saying a word. The world around him seemed to breathe with him, each step he took resonating with the pulse of the universe, each moment an unfolding of the larger story he was part of. There was no need to seek anything beyond this. The journey itself was enough, and in that understanding, Rick found himself at peace. The world around Rick seemed to breathe with a steady, almost imperceptible rhythm, as if the landscape itself had become a living thing, pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. Every step he took felt lighter, as though the earth was no longer just something he walked on, but something that embraced him. The air, now thick with the scent of blossoms and fresh earth, filled his lungs with each breath, grounding him in a way that felt both ordinary and profound. There was no rush, no need to move faster or slower. He moved as he needed, following the quiet current of his own thoughts. The figure beside him still remained silent, its presence felt rather than seen, a comforting, steady companion in the growing silence. It wasn't leading him anymore. There was no need for that. Rick understood now that it wasn't about where he was going. The journey itself, this steady movement through time and space, was the destination. He noticed the subtle changes in the air as he walked. It was as if the landscape was shifting around him, not drastically, but with purpose. The path ahead remained open, yet there was a faint pull at the edges of his consciousness, urging him onward. The world was not just existing around him, it was responding to him, subtly and quietly adjusting to his presence, as though everything had been waiting for him to arrive at this moment. The ground beneath him began to take on a new texture. No longer soft and pliable, it had become more solid, more defined, like the earth was settling into place after being disturbed. It felt like something was solidifying, something he could not yet fully comprehend but could feel pressing at the edges of his awareness. His steps became more deliberate, his body more grounded, as if the earth itself was urging him to plant his feet firmly, to make his presence known. Rick's gaze lifted to the sky above, where the clouds were shifting again, but this time they weren't just moving across the sky. They were forming shapes, fluid and ever-changing, as though the very air around him was being molded into something greater. He could see patterns within the movement of the clouds, a kind of order hidden within the chaos. But it wasn't a logical order. It was something more primal, more intuitive, like the way a song unfolds without the need for a score. The figure beside him had slowed its pace, as if giving him the space to experience this moment alone. And for a brief moment, Rick wondered if it was waiting for him to understand something, to realize a truth that he had been circling all along. But then, just as quickly, the thought faded. He didn't need to understand. He didn't need to rush to a conclusion. Everything was unfolding as it should. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, watching the mist that rose from the earth in the coolness of the night. The air was thick with the sense of something unfinished, something that had always been there but had never quite revealed itself to him. It was as though the world was waiting for him to take the final step, but there was no urgency in it. It wasn't a test to pass or a question to answer. It was simply a moment to be fully present, to exist in the quiet unfolding of everything. Rick stepped forward, his feet lightly grazing the ground as though he were walking on air. The soft pulse of the universe surrounded him, and he felt something within him shift once more, a quiet expansion of the heart, a softening of the mind. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was profound in its subtlety. The figure ahead seemed to step aside, not physically, but in a way that allowed Rick to continue without resistance, without any expectation. It was not a guide anymore. It was simply a presence, a reflection of the journey he had already made, and now it seemed to recede into the background, no longer needed. Rick was standing at the threshold of something. He wasn't sure what yet, but he didn't need to know. The truth, it seemed, was something that would be revealed in time. With a steadying breath, Rick continued forward, letting the world unfold around him. He didn't need to ask for direction anymore. Everything, it seemed, was moving in harmony with him. The path ahead was still unclear, but he could feel the quiet pull of the universe, a subtle but undeniable invitation to continue. And so, he did. The air around Rick seemed to hum with a quiet intensity as he continued forward. Each step felt like a delicate echo of something larger, something unseen, but undeniably present. The landscape around him was shifting again, the contours of the earth softening into a seamless blend of light and shadow, as though the world itself was dissolving and remaking itself with each passing moment. There was no longer a need for direction. There was only the act of moving forward, of existing in this strange, beautiful unfolding. The figure that had once walked beside him was now gone, yet Rick felt its presence in the space between each of his breaths. It wasn't a figure in the traditional sense, but something more abstract, more essential. It was a part of him now, an indelible trace left in the quiet corners of his mind. And for the first time he realized he didn't need it to guide him anymore. He had been the one guiding himself all along. Ahead, a soft light began to form, not from the sky, but from the ground itself. It wasn't blinding, but it was warm, and it seemed to draw everything around it into its gentle embrace. The landscape was no longer static. It was alive, shifting and breathing with a quiet rhythm, like a song unfolding in slow motion. Rick stopped and stood still for a moment, allowing himself to feel the pull of the light. It wasn't a destination. It wasn't a place he was meant to reach. It was simply a reminder, a soft invitation to exist in the moment, to let the world be as it was, without the need for answers. Rick stepped closer to the light, and as he did, he felt something deep within him shift. It wasn't a sudden revelation, not an epiphany. It was a soft recognition, like a long-lost memory finally coming into focus. He had been walking all this time, not to reach a specific place, but to understand that the journey itself was the point. There was nothing to chase, nothing to capture. The world around him seemed to mirror this understanding, shifting in quiet patterns of light and shadow, no longer separate from him, but part of him. The rhythm of the earth, the pulse of the stars, the soft hum of the universe. It was all connected, and in that connection Rick realized that he was not just walking through the world, he was walking with it. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the stillness around him. There was no need to rush. There was no destination. There was only this moment, this place, and the quiet, unspoken truth that he was exactly where he needed to be. When he opened his eyes, the light had softened, blending with the shadows in a way that felt natural, inevitable. There was no sharp divide between light and dark. They were both necessary, both part of the same quiet dance, the same gentle unfolding of the world. Rick stood in the center of it all, feeling more alive than he ever had before, not because of any great revelation, but because he had finally understood that he was part of the rhythm of the world. There was no more separation between him and the landscape, no more distance between him and the journey. He was both the traveler and the path, both the question and the answer. And so he took another step forward, not with urgency, but with acceptance. The light around him faded into the night, and the stars above seemed to shimmer with a quiet understanding. There was no need to chase them anymore. They were already with him. Rick's steps were no longer driven by any sense of urgency, but rather by a quiet pull that guided him forward. The landscape around him continued to shift, its contours flowing with a kind of graceful fluidity that made it feel as though the world itself was alive, changing in response to his presence. He wasn't in control of it. He didn't need to be. There was a deeper understanding now, a soft recognition that the world moved with him, not against him. The air around him had grown warmer, the scent of earth and something sweet, like the faintest trace of blooming flowers, saturating the space. It was no longer just the landscape that was alive. He felt it in himself too. His heart, steady and calm, beat in rhythm with the world around him, as though he were part of a much larger unseen flow. There was no longer any separation between himself and the world. They were intertwined, a quiet dance that required no effort, no intention. Rick stopped for a moment, his eyes lifting to the sky above. The stars, which had once seemed distant and unreachable, now felt close, within reach, like old friends waiting patiently for him to turn his gaze to them. He didn't need to understand their patterns or their stories. They were simply there, part of the same gentle unfolding that had led him to this moment. He could feel their presence, their soft pulse, filling the space around him. And it was in that moment that he realized the journey had always been about this, feeling. He had spent so much of his life searching, questioning, trying to find meaning in places that seemed distant and separate. But now, standing beneath the vast sky, he understood that meaning wasn't something to be found. It was something to be felt, to be lived. With a deep breath, Rick allowed himself to simply be. The earth beneath him, the stars above him, the quiet hum of the universe, they were all part of him, and he was part of them. There was no need to explain it, no need to define it. It simply was. As he stood there, rooted in the present, the landscape around him shifted once more, but this time it felt like a gentle invitation. It wasn't a call to move forward, but a soft gesture to allow himself to stay. The figure that had once walked beside him, though now absent in form, was still present in this moment, quiet, unspoken, a reflection of the stillness Rick had come to embrace. There was no need to search for it, no need to rush to the next moment. Rick understood now that the moment itself, with all its quiet layers, was the answer. He didn't need to chase anything. It had always been with him, unfolding at the pace of his own heart. The world around him felt vast, yet perfectly contained, like a soft breath that expanded and contracted with the rhythm of existence. There were no questions, no unknowns, only this, the gentle, quiet unfolding of the universe and Rick's place within it. He wasn't an outsider looking in. He was part of it, always had been. Rick let the air fill his lungs, his eyes closing for a moment to take it all in. He didn't need to hold on to any of it. It was enough to simply be present, to simply feel the pull of the world as it moved around him. There was no destination, no end. There was only the journey, unfolding softly, like the quiet rhythm of the stars above him. And in that moment, Rick smiled. A small, quiet smile that didn't need words, for he understood something now that he had never understood before. The answers had never been the point. The point had always been the journey itself, and he was exactly where he needed to be. Rick's steps were no longer guided by curiosity or the need for answers. He moved with the same quiet rhythm that had become a part of him, walking not because he was searching for something, but because it felt natural to keep moving forward, as though time itself had softened into something timeless. The land beneath him was no longer solid in the way he had once understood it. It seemed to shift and flow, as though it were made of the same fluid, gentle energy that pulsed through his own body. The air felt different too. It no longer carried the weight of the world's expectations, nor did it hold the coolness of night. It was warm, but not with heat, just the soft, comforting warmth that one feels when embraced by something familiar and unspoken. Every breath Rick took was filled with this warmth, a quiet knowing that he didn't need to chase or strive for anything. He looked up again, this time at the sky, which had shifted into something new. The stars, which had once been distant, now felt closer than ever, like they were beckoning to him, not with words, but with the soft pull of their light. The sky had become a canvas of motion, of colour and light, blending together in a way that made Rick feel both small and infinite at once. He was not apart from the world, but woven into it, part of its gentle unfolding, its quiet rhythm. As he moved forward, the landscape seemed to dissolve and reassemble itself, each change gradual, yet profound. The trees that had once towered over him had transformed into smaller, more delicate forms, their leaves now shimmering with an inner glow. The ground beneath his feet, once solid and firm, had become soft and pliable, like the surface of water, rippling with each step he took. Yet, despite the fluidity of the world around him, there was no sense of instability. Everything was balanced, held together by the same quiet hum that had always accompanied him. Rick didn't feel the need to question any of it anymore. The questions he had once carried with him, the need to understand, had faded into the background. There was no urgency, no rush to make sense of the world. It was enough to simply be in it, to walk through it with an open heart and an open mind. The journey itself, he realized, was the destination. As he continued through the ever-shifting landscape, the pull of the stars above seemed to grow stronger, not in a way that demanded his attention, but in a way that felt like an invitation. It was subtle, like the softest breeze on his skin, but it was undeniable. There was something ahead, something that called to him, but there was no fear, no anticipation. It was simply a soft pull, as if the universe itself was extending a hand, asking him to walk a little further. Rick didn't question it. He simply moved forward, the landscape continuing to change around him, becoming less solid and more ethereal, like the world was becoming a reflection of his own thoughts, his own feelings. He could feel it, the quiet, steady presence of something larger than himself. Not something outside of him, but something inside of him. He continued walking step by step, not knowing what lay ahead, but no longer needing to know. The world was unfolding, and with each step, Rick felt himself becoming a part of it, not as an observer, but as an active participant in the dance of existence. There was no end to this journey, no final destination. There was only this moment, and the next, each one flowing into the other, like a quiet river that never stops moving. Rick didn't need to reach the end. He had already arrived. Rick continued his quiet journey, each step flowing into the next with a natural ease, as though he were moving not through space, but through the very fabric of time itself. The landscape around him had become even more fluid, its edges no longer clearly defined. The ground beneath him was soft, almost yielding, as if it were made of something lighter, something that held no weight but offered a steady support. He could feel the connection between the earth and the stars, between the space around him and the space within him, each pulse of the world resonating through his very being. There was no destination in sight, nor did he seek one. The path was the journey, and the journey was the path. It was all one seamless motion, without beginning or end, without need for explanation. The stillness of the world filled him, and he realized that in the quiet, in the absence of sound and motion, there was a deeper kind of understanding. He had been searching for answers, for meaning, for purpose, but now he saw that all of those things had always been here, woven into the rhythm of the universe. It was not about what he could see or what he could understand. It was about how he moved within it all, how he allowed himself to be part of the flow. The landscape around him changed with each breath he took, not because he was forcing it, but because he was finally allowing it to be. The stars above flickered softly, their light pulsing in time with the beat of his heart. There was no separation now between him and the cosmos, no divide between him and the world that surrounded him. He felt a deep, quiet peace, a sense of being both infinite and incredibly small. It was not a paradox to him anymore. It was simply the way things were. He was part of the stars, part of the earth, part of everything, and yet, in the stillness, he was himself, whole, complete, and enough. He stopped for a moment, allowing the gentle hum of the universe to wash over him. The air around him was rich with the scent of earth and leaves, soft and calming. The light, so warm and constant, bathed everything in a soft glow, and Rick found himself smiling, not because anything had changed, but because everything had become so clear. There was no need to search, no need to chase. Everything was already unfolding. It wasn't a grand revelation. There was no dramatic moment of clarity. It was simply the understanding that everything he had been seeking had always been here. The journey itself was the answer, and there was no need to look for a destination. He had arrived, not in any particular place, but in a quiet, unspoken truth that had always existed within him. Rick took another step, moving forward without haste, but with a quiet sense of confidence. The world around him was still changing, still shifting in ways he couldn't fully comprehend, but he no longer felt the need to understand it all. He could simply be a part of it, moving with it, trusting in the rhythm of the unfolding world. There was nothing to chase, there was nothing to prove. He was part of the dance, part of the movement, and that was enough. As Rick continued his quiet journey, each moment seemed to melt into the next, a seamless flow of time and space that no longer needed to be measured. The landscape, which had once seemed to shift with each step, had settled into a gentle stillness that mirrored the peace he now felt within. There were no abrupt changes now, just a steady rhythm, as though the earth itself had found its own heartbeat, matching his. He didn't need to see where he was going. The path beneath his feet was not a road, but a feeling, a connection that deepened with every breath. He had no destination in mind, yet there was no uncertainty either. For the first time, Rick realized that it wasn't about knowing where he was going, but about being fully present in each step, each heartbeat. The quiet hum of the world, once a distant sound, now filled him completely, like a melody he had always known but could never fully hear until now. The stars above him, though distant, no longer seemed unreachable. They were a part of him, just as the ground beneath him, just as the air he breathed. The universe wasn't vast and separate, it was intimate, woven through every fibre of his being. He didn't need to search for meaning in the stars. He was already part of their rhythm. The stillness around him deepened, not in a way that made him feel alone, but in a way that made him feel connected, as though every element of the world had aligned into a perfect harmony. There was no rush, no need for movement or change. He could simply be, and that was enough. Rick's footsteps slowed, but he didn't stop. The path beneath him had no end. The world around him had no boundaries. It was all one, ever-changing yet constant, an endless unfolding that was both his and not his. He felt no desire to hurry toward any particular place, because the journey itself had become the destination. There was a deep satisfaction in that realization, a quiet understanding that everything he had been searching for was already here, in the space between the stars and the earth, between each breath he took. He didn't need to find himself anymore. He was already here, already part of everything. The figure that had once walked beside him was still with him, but it was no longer a guide. It was a reflection of his own inner peace, his own quiet acceptance. He didn't need to look to it for answers. He had learned to trust his own presence, his own place within the flow of everything. With each step, Rick felt the weight of his past lighten. The questions, the uncertainties, the search for meaning, all of it had faded into the background. There was no more striving. There was only being, and that being was enough. The landscape around him softened again, the earth beneath his feet becoming smoother, the light around him brighter, as though everything was shifting to match the stillness inside him. The rhythm of the world pulsed gently in his chest, and Rick allowed himself to be carried by it, no longer needing to force or control, but simply to exist in harmony with it. He didn't need to know what came next. He didn't need to seek. For the first time, Rick realized that the search had always been an illusion. There was nothing to find. Everything was already here, unfolding in its own time, in its own way. All he had to do was be present, to feel the pulse of the universe moving with him, and that was enough. The world around Rick continued to move, but it was no longer something he felt separate from. With each step, the rhythm of his body, the beat of his heart, and the hum of the earth seemed to blend seamlessly, as though time itself had melted into one continuous present. There was no past, no future. There was only the now, the moment he inhabited, and it felt both infinite and fleeting at once. The landscape shifted gently, like the turn of a page, but nothing felt rushed. The soft light of the stars above flickered, casting long, delicate shadows that danced on the ground around him. The air, thick with the scent of flowers and fresh earth, wrapped him in a cocoon of warmth and stillness. He was no longer moving to get somewhere. He was moving because he was. Part of the world, part of the flow, part of everything. Every step he took was an act of quiet understanding. He had no destination, no goal in mind, but the path beneath him seemed to guide him nonetheless. There was no need to make sense of it, no need to question. It was simply enough to be. The earth was soft beneath his feet, not just solid, but alive in a way that felt ancient, as though it had always been there, waiting for him to recognize it. The stars above were not distant and cold, but close, like old friends offering quiet, unspoken guidance. Rick stopped for a moment, allowing the world to settle around him. The stillness wasn't empty. It was full, full of the pulse of life, full of the quiet hum of everything that existed. He could feel the connection between everything, the stars, the earth, the air, the trees, the quiet sound of his own breath. All of it was part of him, and he was part of it. He didn't need to do anything anymore. He didn't need to search, to understand, to chase. The journey had already brought him here, to this moment, to this understanding. And in that, he felt peace. The figure that had once walked beside him was still there, though no longer physically by his side. It had faded into the very air around him, a quiet presence, a part of the space he now inhabited. It wasn't gone. It had simply become him, and he had become it. Rick let out a slow breath, his chest rising and falling with the soft rhythm of the world around him. He realized now that this had always been the goal, the understanding he had been moving toward, to be without the need for anything else, without the pressure to reach or arrive. He was here, and that was enough. There was no urgency, no demand to move faster or to seek something beyond the moment. Everything he needed was already within him, already surrounding him. All he had to do was let it be, to exist with it, to breathe with the rhythm of the world. With that realization, Rick took another step, but this time it was not with the quiet anticipation that had driven him before. It was with the peace of someone who has finally arrived, who knows that the journey is not about where it leads, but about what it teaches along the way. He no longer sought anything outside of himself. There was nothing to find, no destination to reach. The quiet hum of the universe filled him, and for the first time Rick allowed himself to simply be a part of the rhythm of everything, moving without effort, existing without question. Rick continued, each step bringing him closer to something he couldn't define, yet something he felt with every fiber of his being. The earth beneath him remained soft, welcoming, as though it was shaped by the very rhythm of his breath. He didn't need to understand the way it shifted, the way it moved with him. It simply was, and he, in his quiet understanding, was part of it. The landscape had transformed once more, but this time the change was not so much in the physical world as it was within him. The boundaries of his perception had shifted, allowing him to feel not just the ground beneath him or the sky above, but the very space between the two. There was no division now. There was no here and there. There was only the flow, the pulse, the quiet unfolding of the universe around him, and he was as much a part of it as the air, the earth, the stars. The stars, which had once seemed distant and separate, now felt like old friends, their quiet glow filling him with a warmth that was both external and internal, a reflection of his own stillness. He had not travelled to the stars, but had become one with them, moving in perfect harmony with their rhythm. He didn't need to chase them anymore. They were already within him, just as the earth was, just as the air was. There was no separation, no seeking. There was only being. Rick stopped for a moment, letting the stillness wash over him. He could hear the faint sound of his own heartbeat, a soft thrum that resonated through his chest and into the world around him. It was like the hum of the earth, the pulse of the universe, all of it moving in time with him, with his breath, with his steps. He was part of it all, and in that moment he realized there was no end to the journey. There was no need to arrive anywhere. The journey was the arrival. There was no destination, no final place to reach, because it had always been about the path itself, the quiet unfolding of each step. Rick had been searching for something, but now he understood that what he had been searching for was not something out there, beyond him, but something that had always been inside. The peace he felt, the stillness, was not the result of the world around him changing. It was the result of his own quiet acceptance, his surrender to the flow of everything. The figure that had walked beside him was still present, but no longer as a guide, no longer as a separate being. It had merged with the landscape, with the world, with him. It was not an external force anymore. It was the essence of everything he had become. Rick didn't need to search for answers. He didn't need to chase anything. He simply needed to keep moving forward, with the world, with the flow, with the pulse that had always been there, waiting for him to notice. And so he did, one step at a time, no longer with urgency, no longer with need, but with the quiet assurance that the journey, with all its twists and turns, was exactly what it was meant to be. Rick's pace remained steady, each step bringing him deeper into the rhythm of the world around him, a rhythm that seemed to move not only through the landscape, but through his own body, his own breath. The path beneath his feet had softened even further, and the light that surrounded him had taken on an almost ethereal quality, diffusing through the air as though it were made of the very fabric of time itself. There was no rush, no urgency. There was only the quiet unfolding of the moment, each breath carrying him forward, deeper into the experience. As he moved, He became more aware of the subtle shifts in the air around him, the way the space seemed to open and close with each inhale and exhale. The world felt less like a place to be navigated and more like a sensation to be lived. He was no longer trying to reach anything, and in that realization, he found himself at the center of everything. There was no division anymore between himself and the world, no separation between what he was and what he was experiencing. He was both the journey and the destination, the observer and the observed. The landscape around him continued to change, but in a way that no longer startled him. The transitions were gradual, subtle, like the way the light shifts just before dawn, soft, inevitable, and full of promise. The trees around him had become less distinct, their forms blurring and blending with the light, as though they were made of the same substance as the air itself. The ground beneath him no longer felt solid, yet it never felt unstable. It was as though he was walking on something alive, something that responded to his presence without effort, as though the world itself was cradling him, supporting him, without ever needing to be asked. Rick didn't need to look ahead anymore. The path was no longer something to be followed, it was something to be felt, and in that feeling there was no need for a map or a compass. Each moment was the point, and each step led to the next, not through any conscious decision but through the flow of being itself. There was nothing else but the present, and in the quiet of that present he understood that he had never really been lost. He had simply been moving toward this realization all along. The stillness of the world around him was not an absence but a fullness. It was the silence between the notes of a song, the pause before the breath, the space between thoughts. It was the feeling of belonging, of being held by something far larger than himself, and yet completely his own. There was no need to fight or struggle against it. He could simply exist within it, let it wash over him like the gentle tide that meets the shore. And so he continued forward, not searching, not striving, but moving with the flow of everything. The stars above him shimmered faintly, their light softer now, like a distant memory, and yet closer than ever, like an old friend who had always been beside him, waiting for him to notice. The wind, which had once felt like a force against him, now seemed to move with him, caressing his skin, guiding him without resistance. Rick wasn't trying to understand anymore. He wasn't looking for meaning in the way he once had. He simply was. And in that being, everything else fell into place. He no longer felt the need to find answers or to know what lay ahead. The quiet, gentle pulse of the world was enough. He was part of it, and that was all he needed to know. The world around Rick remained a soft, ever-shifting presence, constantly in motion yet steady in its rhythm. He no longer felt the need to track time, to measure distance, or to question the way things were unfolding. Everything was moving together as one continuous breath, and Rick was as much a part of it as the wind that rustled through the trees, the stars that flickered above, and the earth that gently supported him with every step. He was no longer searching for meaning, not because he had found it, but because he had learned to trust the quiet flow of the world. Each moment held its own significance, and Rick had learned to see it in its entirety, without rushing to define it, without needing to hold on to it. There was no fear of what was to come, no anxiety over what had been. There was only the now, and in that now there was peace. As he moved forward, Rick began to notice the smallest details, the way the air felt cooler in certain spots, the way the light filtered through the gaps in the trees, the way the ground beneath him seemed to hum with a subtle energy. These were things he had once overlooked, too caught up in the search for something more, something beyond. But now, in the stillness of the moment, he saw them all with new clarity. The world was not something to be understood or conquered. It was something to be experienced, to be lived in, and to be embraced fully. He had not been walking toward any particular place. He had not been following any path that would lead him to an end. The journey itself had been the point all along, and now, as the world around him continued to unfold, Rick understood that the beauty of it lay in its simplicity. There was no need to look for answers or meaning in any particular destination. There was only the path itself. The stars above him seemed even closer now, their soft light bathing the landscape in a peaceful glow. They were not distant points of light in a vast, indifferent sky. They were a part of the landscape, a part of him, and he, in turn, was a part of them. The separation between himself and the world around him had faded completely. There was no longer any division between the inner and outer worlds. They had become one, each influencing the other in a quiet, gentle dance. Rick could feel the pulse of the universe in his chest, a soft, steady rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. He didn't need to understand it. He didn't need to explain it. He only needed to be present with it, to breathe in time with the world, and to let the journey unfold at its own pace. The ground beneath him seemed to grow softer still, and the air around him seemed to become more vibrant, filled with the sounds of a world that had always been alive, always been waiting. Rick continued forward, not with the desire to reach any destination, but with the quiet certainty that each step was part of the whole, part of the unfolding that had always been there. There was no final destination waiting for him. There was only the journey itself. And as he walked, Rick felt the peace of that realization settle deep within him. There was nothing else to search for, nothing else to seek. The quiet hum of the universe was all that he needed, and in that hum, he found everything. Rick continued his journey, but now it was not about moving forward in any traditional sense. There was no destination in mind, no end in sight. The path beneath his feet had become less of a road and more of a flowing current, soft and ever-changing, like the pulse of the earth itself. He didn't need to know where it led. He didn't need to understand it. He simply moved with it, part of the current, part of the flow, allowing it to carry him wherever it wished. The landscape around him, which had once seemed to shift and change with each step, now felt as though it had settled, as if the very earth was breathing with him. The trees, once towering and solid, were now soft, pliable, their branches swaying gently in time with his movements. The sky above, which had once seemed so vast, now felt close like a great canvas unfolding just above him. The stars, always present, now seemed to shimmer more brightly, not as distant pinpricks of light, but as part of the same warmth and energy that surrounded him. There was no division between the earth and the sky, no separation between the world and himself. Everything was woven together, a seamless living tapestry that moved and shifted with the rhythm of life itself. He felt no desire to understand it. He felt no need to name it. He simply allowed himself to exist within it, to breathe with it, and in that simple act of being, he was at peace. The quiet hum that had followed him since the beginning had grown louder, more resonant, until it filled every corner of his being. It was not a sound in the traditional sense, it was more like a vibration, a deep pulse that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the sky, from the stars. It was the sound of existence itself, the quiet pulse that connected all things, and Rick could feel it in his chest, in his bones, in every breath he took. He no longer felt the need to search for anything, nor to push forward with any great effort. The journey was no longer a pursuit. It was a dance, a flowing movement, an unfolding. And in that unfolding, Rick found something he had been searching for without realizing it, a quiet, enduring peace that filled the space between each step, each breath. He stopped for a moment, allowing himself to stand still, feeling the world continue its soft rhythm around him. He didn't need to look ahead anymore. He didn't need to search for what lay beyond the horizon. The peace he felt was not dependent on the world outside. It was within him, a part of him, woven into the very fabric of his being. And in that stillness, in that knowing, he realized that everything had always been exactly as it should be. With a soft smile, he took another step, his feet barely making a sound on the soft earth beneath him. He no longer questioned where he was going, nor did he feel any need to rush. The world was unfolding at its own pace, and he, like the stars above, was part of that unfolding. Rick continued to walk, each step feeling lighter, as if the earth itself was gently lifting him, supporting him in a way he had never fully understood until now. He had long ago stopped searching for answers, stopped trying to make sense of the path ahead. There was nothing to rush toward, no goal to be reached. The journey itself had become everything, and in that understanding Rick felt a profound sense of stillness, The world around him seemed to breathe with him, moving in time with his quiet, steady rhythm. The stars above, once distant and unfathomable, were now a soft, comforting presence. They weren't points of light far beyond reach. They were like old friends, sharing their quiet glow, their gentle wisdom. Rick no longer saw them as separate from himself. He was part of the sky, part of the earth, part of everything that surrounded him. There was no distinction between his own pulse and the pulse of the universe. They were one, moving in perfect harmony. The air around him felt warm now, not with the heat of day, but with a soft, soothing warmth that seemed to radiate from everything, the trees, the earth, the stars themselves. It was a warmth that was not only physical, but emotional, like the embrace of something greater, something eternal. Rick had felt the pull of this warmth from the very beginning, but now, in this moment, he understood it fully. It wasn't something he could ever grasp, not in the way he had once hoped to. It was something to be felt, to be experienced. He stopped again, not because he needed rest, but because the stillness had become so profound that he couldn't help but acknowledge it. The world around him seemed to pause with him, as though everything were holding its breath, waiting for him to notice. He didn't need to do anything. There was nothing to fix, nothing to change. Everything was exactly as it should be. The understanding he had long searched for, the peace he had always yearned for, was not something he could find in the world. It was something that had always been inside him, waiting to be noticed. With that understanding, Rick took another step forward, not with a sense of purpose, but with the quiet certainty that every step he took was a step of his own choosing. The path, though ever shifting, was his to walk, and there was no longer any fear in that. There was only acceptance, only the quiet unfolding of everything that had always been. The universe, it seemed, was not something outside of him. It was a part of him, and he was a part of it. The boundaries between them had dissolved, and in that dissolution Rick found his place within it all. It was not a place of finality, not a place of completion. It was simply a place of being, a place where the journey was the destination, where the path was not to be understood but to be lived. And so he continued, step by step, breathing in time with the world, moving with the rhythm of the stars, of the earth, of everything that existed. The journey had no end, but Rick no longer felt the need for one. He was already exactly where he needed to be. Rick continued, each step now a quiet affirmation of his place within the world. The journey, once filled with questions and uncertainty, had transformed into something gentle, a flow of time that did not ask him to hurry or search for meaning. It was simply about being in the moment, feeling the pull of the earth beneath his feet, the warmth of the air, the light of the stars. Everything around him was unfolding, and Rick, in his quiet understanding, was a part of that unfolding. The landscape, though ever-changing, had lost the sharpness of distinction. There was no longer any division between the trees and the sky, the ground and the stars. Everything seemed to merge, to exist together as one vast living entity. Rick moved through it with ease, no longer questioning the transitions that occurred with each step. The flow was natural, inevitable. It was as though the landscape, the universe itself, had been waiting for him to notice that it was all the same. His mind, once filled with the desire to understand, had quieted. There was no need for answers now. The world, in its gentle rhythm, had no need for explanation. It simply was, and Rick, with every step, felt himself becoming one with it. The sensation of belonging, of connection, was profound in its simplicity. He was no longer a traveller moving towards something distant. He was part of the movement itself, part of the landscape, part of the stars above. He stopped for a moment, his eyes lifted to the sky, now soft and glowing with the faint light of a new phase in the night. The stars seemed closer, not distant, as if they too were waiting for him to see them, to feel their presence. It wasn't a feeling of longing or desire, but of recognition, like meeting an old friend after a long time, knowing without words that they had always been with you. There was no urgency to the stars, no need to chase them. They were simply there, as much a part of the world as the earth beneath his feet, and he, in turn, was a part of them, as much a part of the night as the light that shone from above. He didn't need to search for anything. everything he had sought was already here, within him, within the world around him. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the stillness of the universe to wash over him. The quiet hum of the world, the soft pulse of the stars, the rhythm of his own breath. It was all one, all connected, all flowing together. There was no separation. There was only the quiet acceptance of the moment, of the journey. And in that quiet, he understood. This was the truth he had been walking toward all along, not some grand revelation, but the simple recognition that everything, even the search itself, had always been part of the whole. He opened his eyes, and the landscape seemed to shimmer, softening as if in acknowledgement of his understanding. There was no grand change, no sudden revelation. It was simply the soft realization that he was exactly where he needed to be, as part of the vast, flowing whole that was always in motion, always unfolding. And so, Rick continued, not with the need to reach a destination, but with the quiet understanding that the journey itself was all there ever was. Each step, each breath was part of the rhythm of the universe, and in that, he found his peace. The path was no longer something to be travelled, it was something to be lived. Rick continued his quiet journey, each step an effortless progression into the stillness of the world around him. The ground beneath him remained soft, no longer something solid, but something alive, alive with the pulse of the earth itself. He didn't need to understand it, didn't need to analyze it. It was simply there, and in its presence, Rick felt more whole than he had ever known. The landscape, too, had softened. Where once there had been clear distinctions between the trees, the sky, the earth, now everything seemed to blend together in a harmonious flow. It was as though the world itself had melted into one continuous being, unbroken and complete. There were no longer edges to define where one thing ended and another began. The whole was the sum of its parts, each moment a reflection of the next, each breath a continuation of the one before it. Rick moved forward, not with the urgency of a traveller, but with the quiet grace of someone who had already arrived. There was no need to rush. There was no destination, no endpoint to reach. Each moment, each step, was part of the unfolding, part of the journey that was not about getting somewhere, but about being where he was. The stars, always there, seemed to shimmer more brightly now, their light not distant or cold but present, as if they were not far above him, but a part of him. Their quiet glow filled him with a peace that was not external, but internal, like a soft warmth spreading through his chest, radiating outward. They were not separate from him. He was a part of them, just as the earth beneath his feet was a part of him. In the stillness, Rick closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the world pulse around him, beneath him, above him, within him. He was not isolated. He was part of the flow, the constant movement of the universe. The stars were not simply shining above, they were shining within him, in the space between his thoughts, in the quiet rhythm of his breath. He let out a slow breath, and with it he felt something release, something that had been with him for so long, a tension he hadn't fully realized until now. It was not a tension of the body, but a tension of the mind, a need for answers, for control, for understanding. All of that had faded. It was no longer necessary. There was nothing to grasp, nothing to chase. Rick opened his eyes and saw the landscape before him, still shifting, still unfolding, but now he saw it for what it truly was. Not a journey, to be travelled, but a moment to be lived. Each blade of grass, each tree, each star in the sky, all of it was simply part of the whole, and in that whole there was no need to strive. There was only being, only existing within the rhythm of everything. He took another step, not because he needed to, but because it felt natural. The world moved with him, each step part of the same quiet unfolding. He no longer questioned it. He didn't need to understand it. It simply was, and he was part of it. The light around him softened, deepened, becoming more diffuse, but in that softening Rick felt a deeper sense of belonging, a deeper sense of peace. There was nothing left to seek, nothing left to find. He was already where he needed to be, And in that understanding he smiled, a quiet, serene smile, because he knew without any doubt that he had always been here. Rick's steps had become almost effortless, as though the very ground beneath him was lifting him with each stride, guiding him forward in a quiet dance that mirrored the rhythm of his breath. He no longer noticed the changes in the landscape, for they had become one with him. The world around him, once filled with sharp contrasts, had softened into a seamless living tapestry. Each leaf, each blade of grass, every flicker of light, everything moved with him, in him, as if they were all the same, a single, gentle flow. He no longer questioned the world around him. It wasn't because he had answers. There were no answers anymore. It was because the question itself had faded into the background. There was no need to understand, no need to search. He had learned that understanding wasn't something to be grasped. It was something to be experienced, to be lived. And that was enough. The quiet hum of the universe still filled him, but it had become more subtle, like the softest melody playing in the distance, always present but never demanding. It was the sound of existence itself, the pulse of the earth, the rhythm of the stars, and it had woven itself into the very fabric of his being. He was no longer apart from it. He was a part of it, and it was a part of him. Rick stopped for a moment, allowing the stillness to settle around him. The soft light of the stars above continued to shimmer, but now he didn't see them as distant points of light. He felt them deep within, as if they were the quiet flickers of his own thoughts, his own awareness. They weren't out there, somewhere beyond him. They were within him, just as the air, the earth, the trees were within him. The boundaries between himself and the world had completely dissolved, and in that moment, Rick felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Not the kind of peace that came from answers or resolutions, but the kind that came from simply being. He was not searching for anything anymore. There was nothing to chase. There was no need to find meaning in any particular place or time. The meaning was in the journey itself, in the act of moving through it, in being present in each breath, each moment. He didn't need to see what lay ahead. There was no destination anymore, not in the way he had once thought of it. The path was already here, already unfolding beneath him, and it would continue to unfold, endlessly, in the quiet rhythm of the universe. And he too would continue, moving with it, in perfect harmony, without the need to understand where it would lead. Rick began to walk again, not because there was somewhere to go, but because the journey itself was a way of being, a way of embracing the world without the need to control it. The earth beneath his feet felt both solid and soft, a grounding force that supported him as he moved through the ever-changing landscape. And the stars above, once distant, now felt like companions, quietly guiding him, not by telling him where to go, but by simply existing, by being present. In this stillness, in this quiet flow, Rick found everything he had been searching for, not in any grand revelation, but in the simple acceptance of the moment. The world, the stars, the earth, all of it was exactly as it should be, and so was he. Rick moved forward, not because he had to, but because the flow of the world seemed to pull him gently, effortlessly. The ground beneath his feet had become even softer, and with each step the feeling of weightlessness returned. It was as if the earth itself was not just supporting him, but holding him in a tender, unspoken embrace. The light around him had shifted again, softer now, as though the world was dimming, but it wasn't darkness. It was a gentle twilight, like the space between breaths, calm and endless. There was no sense of time pressing upon him, no urgency to his movements. He no longer felt the need to understand the world around him, or to reach any particular place. The quiet hum of existence still filled him, but it had become more refined, more intimate, like the subtle sound of wind through leaves, or the soft murmur of a stream. It was not a call to action, but a call to be present, to simply allow the unfolding of the moment. Rick felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for any one thing, but for the whole experience. The journey, which had once felt like a quest, was now an unfolding, a soft revelation with no need for words. He was not searching for answers anymore. The questions had fallen away, and in their place was something even more profound. Acceptance. Acceptance of the world, of his place in it, of the fact that everything, even the quietest moments, was part of the larger flow. The stars above him seemed to shimmer with a quiet resonance, not separate from him, but a reflection of his own quiet heart. They pulsed softly, in time with the rhythm of the universe, and Rick understood, not in words but in feeling, that he too was part of that pulse. It wasn't about standing apart from the world and observing it. It was about being within it, flowing with it, like a note in a song. That was never meant to be played alone, but as part of the greater harmony. As he walked, the landscape around him shifted once more, but the change felt different now. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It was more like a soft exhale, a gentle release of tension. The world, once full of sharp contrasts, had softened into a seamless whole. The lines between land and sky, between earth and stars, had blurred, and Rick felt himself becoming part of that blending. There was no more separation. There was no more distinction between himself and the world around him. He was not just in it. He was it. For the first time, Rick realized that there was no end to the journey, no final destination waiting for him. The journey itself was the destination, and the moment he had been searching for had always been here, inside him, in the quiet rhythm of his breath, in the stillness of the world, in the soft unfolding of each step. There was no rush. There was no need to move faster or to hurry toward an unknown end. Everything was exactly as it should be. With each step forward, Rick felt himself becoming more deeply aligned with the world around him. The stars no longer seemed distant, but were a reflection of the quiet light within him. The landscape, though ever-changing, felt constant, held together by the same invisible thread that wove the earth, the stars, and himself into one seamless, living whole. And as he walked, Rick no longer wondered where the path would lead. He knew that wherever it led, he was already there. He was already home. Rick walked on, each step deeper into the quiet pulse of the world that surrounded him. The landscape, ever shifting and ever constant, seemed to hold its breath with him. It was as if time had softened, stretched out in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like the ebb and flow of the ocean's tides. He no longer felt the need to hurry, to search, to race toward an imagined future. He was fully immersed in the now, in the delicate unfolding of the moment, and with that understanding came a profound sense of peace. The stars above him shone brighter, though they did not stand apart from him. They were woven into the very fabric of his being, a reflection of his own stillness. Rick could feel their light, not as something separate, but as something that existed within him, filling every quiet space, every breath. The sky above was no longer vast and unreachable. It was as close as his own heartbeat, as natural as the rhythm of his breath. The ground beneath him was soft and solid all at once, a paradox that no longer needed explaining. It was as though the earth had become a part of him, just as he was a part of it. The connection between himself and the world had become seamless, effortless, a gentle flow that carried him forward with no resistance. Each step was not a movement toward something, but a movement with the world, with the pulse of the universe itself. There was no longer any division between him and the landscape. The trees that had once been separate entities were now a part of the same fabric, their branches reaching toward him as though inviting him to join in their quiet dance. The air was alive with a soft energy, and Rick could feel it moving through him, around him, carrying him forward without the need for direction. The path was no longer a thing to be walked. It had become the very movement of life itself. Rick felt a warmth spread through him, not from the outside, but from within. It was as though the peace he had been searching for, the peace that had always eluded him, was now filling every corner of his being. There was no more searching for answers, no more striving. Everything he had sought had already been found, not in some distant future, but in the quiet of the present moment. With each step, he felt more at home, more aligned with the rhythm of the world. The boundaries that had once defined him, that had once separated him from the landscape, from the stars, from everything else, had melted away. He was no longer an observer. He was a part of it all, woven into the same fabric, moving with the same gentle current. There was no more need for effort, no more need to force anything. The world had already embraced him, and in return, he embraced it. Rick took another step, his feet lightly brushing against the earth. There was no end to this journey, no final destination. The journey was the destination, the quiet, steady flow of life, the unfolding of the moment, was everything. He didn't need to ask where it would lead. It had already led him here, to this place of profound peace, of quiet understanding, and so he continued, not out of necessity, but because it was the only thing left to do, to move with the world, to breathe with it, to exist within it. Everything had already been given, and in that gift Rick found his peace. He was exactly where he needed to be.